Hey guys, I wanted to share how drugs ruined my life over the last 10 years. I started out just using LSD, Molly at raves when I was in college. I thought this was fairly harmless. There wasn't really an issue with that as long as it was in moderation. But then things started getting pretty bad when I was smoking wax every day, was using these THC concentrates all the time. And I began developing psychological dependency on weed, where I would get really angry or really restless and just a total monster when I didn't have it. And this went on over the course of the year, freshman year of college. And then when I returned home, I had my first episode of psychosis. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was smoking weed, and something just turned on in my mind, and it's not really quite been the same since. So that was kind of the pivotal moment where things really started to go south. But even after the psychosis, I still had this really extreme curiosity about drugs, just wanting to alter my mind, wanting to experience a different state or get out of a bored state of mind or whatever it was. And I started buying drugs online shortly after I left college, and that's when things got really bad. I would buy all kinds of different drugs, everything from like 2CB to even heroin. I never injected heroin. I snorted it a couple times. I didn't like that drug, thankfully. So that's obviously great that I didn't get dependent on something like that. But it's just this concept of being so curious about drugs, wanting to try everything out and this kind of seeking of drugs just continued to go on for years, even when I would have psychotic episodes from it. For instance, ketamine. I had a horrible episode of psychosis from ketamine shortly after I started buying drugs online. I wound up in rehab. I hated. I hated people talking the 12 steps and things like that. I was just more determined to live my life and do drugs or whatever. And so when I was 23, I traveled to Medellin, Colombia for the first time. Totally lost my mind over there. I combined like cocaine and clonazepam, almost had a heart attack. It was just constant drinking, weed, benzos, cocaine, sometimes ecstasy or whatever, just whatever drugs were floating around over there. I pretty much would do it. And again, it degraded my mind. It really caused a lot of issues for me. I came back to the US. I ended up in rehab again. As I said, I really hated rehab. And I would kind of I developed into this person that's constantly trying to escape my circumstance in the US. I was working a few crappy jobs like in security, driving Uber, just things that I never drove Uber when I was messed up, obviously. But the little bit of work I did here, I just hated it. And I was always fantasizing about just doing drugs and going back to doing my thing. So I traveled to Colombia again. I had another similar issue where I just had a binge on drugs. I had a bad shroom trip. I went psychotic in Colombia. I wound up in a psych ward in Medellin. So it seemed like every time I would have a drug binge and something horrible would happen, I would end up in the psych ward. I would just say, oh, forget about it. I'm going to keep doing this because I have a right to do it. Or I can't even really explain to you why I continue doing these things. Um, but I realized that going to Colombia and buying drugs is a big problem. And briefly, the last time I was in Colombia, I started buying Percocet over the counter, and for about a month's time, I was getting really heavy into opiates. I almost slipped into a really bad state with that. Luckily, I gave that up because it had enough negative effects for me. I would get really agitated on it. That it wasn't honestly it wasn't quite as hard to quit for me as a daily marijuana habit, believe it or not. But everyone's different. But I realized that traveling over here, getting into pills, partying all the time, whatever. It was just destroying me. And, so over the course of the last 10 years, I've had a lot of psychotic episodes from drugs. I really noticed that now if I do anything, like even just drinking or whatever casual social weed use, I'll just feel like shit for like days afterwards because my brain is just done with it. Like at first, it's real fun. Like right when you start experimenting with stuff when you're a kid, you're like, oh wow, this is it's like it's exciting when you're young, but then you get older and your brain really gets sick of it, and it just you have days of hell to pay for like 1 hour of fun, and it's just not worth it at all. So I just want to share that drugs have added nothing positive to my life at all. Um, I was really concerned about just getting dependent in general on being in an altered state. I made a decision that I had to stop. It hasn't really been easy, but um, yeah, it's just something that I don't personally recommend going down the road I did.